It was late September 2018, just past midnight, when we started the drive back from the camping trip. The woods had been quiet that weekend, cooler than usual, with the faint smell of decaying leaves lingering in the damp air. We were tired, each of us carrying the kind of exhaustion that sinks into your bones after days spent hiking, setting up tents, and staring into campfires until the flames died down. The trip had been simple, intentionally so. We had wanted to escape the city, the hum of traffic, the fluorescent lights of our apartments, the constant pressure of schedules. Everything had felt deliberate, the weight of backpacks, the scrape of sleeping bags, the sharp taste of cold water from the stream. But now, behind the wheel, I felt that clarity fading into weariness, the kind that makes the world outside feel distant and unreal. The road was empty, not a single car in sight. It was a Tulane asphalt ribbon stretching through the countryside, flanked on both sides by dense forest that seemed to press against the headlights like it wanted to absorb the light entirely. The fog rolled in slowly at first, a soft haze that blurred the edges of trees, flattened the curves of the road, and muted the faint glow of the moon. By the time we reached the middle of the stretch, the fog had thickened into something almost solid, like a curtain drawn across the world. The beams from Lucas's headlights barely cut through it, and the world beyond the hood of the car was reduced to a ghostly gray void. I remember noticing how quiet it became. Not just the absence of cars, but the complete absence of sound. Even the tires, normally whining against the pavement, seemed to move without resistance. I could hear my own breathing in the enclosed space of the car, the slow exhale that came from deep in my chest, and it sounded far too loud, intrusive in the otherwise muffled world. Lucas drove cautiously, hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. I could see it in the way his knuckles whitened with each turn. The road twisted gently, and every curve seemed to hold the promise of something unknown. Then, suddenly they appeared. I only saw them for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make my stomach clench. Figures, or something like figures, standing on the shoulder, waving their arms frantically. Not the kind of wave you give a friend across a field, but desperate, urgent, a movement meant to demand attention or warn. Lucas swerved instinctively, the car fishtailing slightly before regaining traction. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might hear it in the fog outside. When the headlights swung back toward the shoulder, there was nothing. The figures had vanished, as if the mist itself had swallowed them. We argued about it later, silently, each of us locked in our own mind, trying to make sense of what we had seen. Were we imagining things? Had exhaustion warped our perception, turning shadows into gestures, fog into bodies? My rational mind tried to insist that it had to be a trick of the light, maybe deer caught mid-stride, maybe branches swaying in the wind. But a deeper part of me knew it wasn't. The way those figures moved, the urgency in their motion, it didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the woods or on any road. For the next 10 minutes, the drive was tense. We slowed down, our tires making a soft hiss against the wet asphalt, our eyes scanning the edges of the road, the trees, the fog. It felt as if the forest itself had turned hostile, that every tree was leaning closer, eavesdropping on our small passage. Then we saw it, another detail that defied explanation. Headlights swept over the asphalt and caught the faint impressions left behind. Long, claw-like tracks pressed into the surface of the road where the figures had stood. They were elongated, sharp at the edges, carved into the asphalt in a way that suggested weight and force. They didn't match human footprints. They weren't from any animal I could identify. No scent lingered, no broken branches or disturbed leaves led away from them. They started and ended abruptly, just like the figures themselves. I remember slowing the car even further, letting the fog swallow the vehicle, letting the sound of our tires become a low hum beneath the weight of what we had seen. The tracks disappeared into the mist ahead, leaving only the empty road, the faint reflections of headlights bouncing off water droplets clinging to the surface. The mist seemed to absorb everything, the traces, the shapes, the edges of the trees, until the world beyond our car was nothing but a void punctuated by two narrow beams of light. The rest of the drive felt like a blur. Every movement of the steering wheel was heavy, deliberate. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint curve of asphalt ahead, on the fog rolling over the surface like a tide. Lucas didn't speak, and I didn't either. Each of us was trapped in our thoughts, trying to rationalize, try to dismiss what we had seen, but unable to. The mind wants to make sense of terror, wants to categorize it, but some things resist categorization. I didn't even notice when the fog began to thin slightly, as though it had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. By the time we reached the next town, a small cluster of lights spilling yellow onto the highway, the tension began to ease. Exhaustion and relief intertwined, making the air in the car feel lighter, warmer. I remember pulling into a gas station, the smell of fuel and the flicker of fluorescent lighting grounding us back in reality. I looked back down the road we had come from, expecting the mist to linger, expecting something else to materialize from it. But the asphalt was empty, dry now, ordinary. In the days afterward, I thought about it constantly. I tried to imagine natural explanations. The fog, exhaustion, shadows, but every mental reconstruction felt incomplete. The tracks weren't something my mind could invent, and the movement of the figures wasn't something my tired imagination could replicate. I kept returning to that detail, the suddenness of their appearance, the urgency in their motion, and the fact that nothing followed, nothing led away. It left me with a kind of lasting unease, not fear of the woods or animals, but a recognition that there are things in the world that don't fit neatly into what we know. I never found an explanation. We returned to that road months later during the day. It was empty, quiet, lined with the same trees, the same curves, the same asphalt. There were no tracks, no hints of figures, no urgency. Just the road, sunlight spilling across it, ordinary. But the memory remained sharp and cold, lodged in the center of my chest. I never forgot the way the fog swallowed them, the way they moved, the way the road seemed to mark their presence and then deny it completely. It was a late-night drive, an ordinary return from a camping trip, yet it changed the way I thought about being alone on the road. Even in daylight, even with other cars passing, I feel that weight sometimes, the sense that there are moments, places, and shapes just outside the limits of perception, waiting for a flicker of recognition. And though I have no explanation, I have a certainty of what I saw, the sharp clawed impressions on asphalt, the vanishing figures, and the long, oppressive quiet of the foggy road. It is a memory that lingers, fully formed, unshakable, a reminder that reality can sometimes be stranger than imagination, and that even in the absence of reason, some events are undeniable. I was driving home from a friend's wedding, the kind of wedding that drags on longer than you expect, with speeches that stretch thin into the night and music that lingers in your head, even after the hall empties. I had left late, the roads empty and quiet, the air cold but calm, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine from the surrounding forest. My car's headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the narrow asphalt that twisted and turned like a ribbon through the countryside. I felt the fatigue pressing in from the evening celebrations, the kind that dulls your senses, and yet something in me insisted on keeping alert. The highway had thinned into a rural back road, barely wide enough for two cars to pass, lined with trees that arched overhead and formed shadow tunnels. Every few minutes, the beam of my headlights would catch on a reflective road sign, the metal glinting white, the rest swallowed in darkness. My hands gripped the wheel a little tighter as I passed the last few houses, their windows dark, no cars and driveways, no sound except the occasional rustle of leaves or a far-off dog barking. It was the kind of road that demands caution, especially late at night, but I had done this drive countless times and usually found it uneventful. That night was different. I had just passed a curve where the road sloped downward and then rose again, a gentle hill that hid the forest on either side. My headlights briefly caught a flicker of color to the right, through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a reflection from some distant traffic sign or a flashing light from a house deep in the woods, but the intensity of it drew my attention. It was a glow, soft but unmistakable, and it had a hue I hadn't seen in natural light before. Something in me resisted looking away. I slowed, instinct mixing with curiosity. The glow was steady now, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, and as I pressed the brakes, the tires on the asphalt hissing softly, I realized it was coming from a campfire. Flames licked upward, but the color was a deep, unnatural blue. The flames danced in ways that seemed oddly deliberate, almost liquid, and there was no one tending the fire. The ground around it was disturbed, leaves scattered as if someone had just been there, but the air was empty. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to see if it was a reflection, some trick of the moonlight or the humidity. The shadows around the fire were the first thing to really set me on edge. They were long, thin, stretching unnaturally, moving faster than they should. Trees in that section swayed in the wind, but these shadows seemed alive, darting and twisting without logic, bending around invisible shapes that the light should have left visible. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was a trick of perspective, that the shadows were the branches, or maybe an animal moving too fast for my eyes to catch. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, but the unease dug in deeper than reason could reach. I pressed the accelerator. The engine roared louder than necessary, echoing slightly against the silent trees. I didn't dare look away, yet I couldn't help glancing in the side mirror, hoping to see the fire shrink behind me. But it didn't. Even as I reached the next bend in the road, the blue glow lingered, stubborn and unreal, threading through the trees like it was moving with me. My stomach knotted and a cold sweat ran down my back. I forced my eyes back to the road, telling myself that whatever it was, it belonged there and I belonged here, moving away from it. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening, and I could feel my breathing shallow and fast. The headlights cut through the darkness, but nothing in the forest moved except the occasional tree limb swaying in the wind. The road curved again, the asphalt slick with moisture, reflecting my headlights back in streaks, and I felt my tension ease only slightly with each turn that carried me farther from that strange fire. The more distance I put between myself and the glow, the more I replayed what I had seen in my head. Blue flames are possible under certain conditions, I reasoned. Chemical fires, discarded accelerants, campfires treated with unusual minerals. But the speed of the shadows, the way they seemed to stretch and shift independently, that I couldn't explain. My mind, exhausted and still racing from the wedding, tried to settle into logic, but logic failed to erase the feeling of being watched, the prickling awareness at the base of my skull that told me this was not normal. I finally reached a stretch of road where the trees were thinner, the moon peeking through the clouds to reveal the forest floor in patches of silver light. The blue glow was gone, replaced by ordinary shadows and the muted browns and blacks of winter underbrush. I slowed, letting the car coast for a moment, taking stock of my surroundings. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt altered. My pulse had settled a bit, but a lingering tension remained, a weight pressing down in my chest. In the distance, I could see the lights of a small town beginning to flicker against the horizon. Houses, streetlights, the occasional car passing by. Civilization felt almost alien after the stretch of isolation I had just driven through, the kind that leaves your senses raw, hyper-aware of movement, sound, and light. I thought about stopping, maybe turning back, retracing my path to see if I could find some mundane explanation for what I saw. But my legs refused to obey that impulse. I wanted to leave it behind, to forget it, to let rational explanations fill the gaps. By the time I reached the highway that would take me the rest of the way home, I could finally let my hands relax on the wheel. The fire and the shadows felt like a memory I wasn't supposed to hold on to, something that belonged only in the moment I had passed it. My phone buzzed with notifications from friends checking in, texts from the wedding, and the mundane hum of life began to reclaim me. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a faint blue flicker again, but the road behind me was empty, the trees silent and still. I never found out what had caused it. Chemical fire, prank, some trick of light and wind combined. Nothing explained the unnatural movement of the shadows. I've driven that road many times since, sometimes late at night, and nothing has appeared again. And yet, whenever I think about that night, the image of blue flames burning alone in the dark forest returns, and I can feel the same uneasy pull, the same instinct to accelerate and not look back, carrying me forward into the ordinary safety of streetlights and asphalt, leaving the strange and unexplained behind. I finally pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house grounding me, the engine's rumble fading as I killed the ignition. The normal world felt impossibly close and impossibly distant at the same time. I stepped out of the car and stood for a long moment, listening to the quiet of my neighborhood, the sound of distant traffic and wind in the trees. The fire was gone, the shadows non-existent, but the memory of them remained, etched into my mind as sharply as if I had just driven past them. That night, the forest had offered me a glimpse of something I couldn't explain, and the lesson I carried home was simple. Sometimes curiosity isn't a choice, but the consequences of pursuing it are very real, and the safest path is the one that keeps you moving forward, eyes on the road, and never looking back. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. Jessie had dared me earlier in the evening to take a detour through a rarely used overpass just outside the city. She said it was haunted, her voice laced with amusement, and I had laughed it off. I didn't believe in haunted places, never had. The road was empty when I turned off the main highway, and the car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds along the shoulder. The smell of damp concrete and old leaves clung to the air, carried by a faint breeze that seemed too cold for February. The streetlights along the ramp flickered intermittently, throwing brief, jagged shadows across the pavement. Each time one blinked out, the darkness felt heavier, pressing against the edges of my vision. I kept my foot steady on the accelerator, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The overpass rose ahead, a massive structure of concrete and steel, its underside coated with years of grime and graffiti. The sound of the car's engine echoed against the supports, a low, hollow resonance that made the space feel larger, emptier, and somehow alive. As I drove under the bridge, the beam of the headlights swept across the walls, and that's when I noticed the scratches. They were long, thin, jagged, etched into the concrete as if someone had dragged something heavy along it. Fresh looking, the streaks were dark in the light and glistened faintly, catching each flicker of the failing streetlights. I slowed the car instinctively, a cold feeling crawling up my spine. The scratches were too deliberate to be random, where too chaotic to be an accident, and the way they curve along the wall suggested someone had moved with purpose. Then, at the edge of the overpass, I saw a figure crouched, watching us. I couldn't make out much, just a dark silhouette against the concrete, hunched low like it was hiding or waiting. My heart jumped, an instinctive spike of panic, and I pressed the accelerator. The tires squealed slightly against the worn pavement, and the headlights flickered in rhythm with the faulty street lamps. I kept my eyes forward, but kept stealing glances at the rearview mirror. After we cleared the end of the ramp, I glanced back. The figure wasn't there anymore. The spot was empty. A hollow echo of the tires rolling over the uneven asphalt was the only sound that remained. I exhaled slowly, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe someone had been sitting on the edge. Maybe it was a passerby who had hidden when the car approached. But the scratches, those stayed in my mind. They lingered in the glow of the headlights, even as we moved further away. The overpass behind me faded into darkness, swallowed by the shadows of the surrounding trees and the quiet hum of the highway. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, telling myself it had been nothing, just my imagination magnifying the scratches and the fleeting figure. But every time I moved my eyes to the rearview mirror, I caught the faint reflection of the highway signs and the concrete walls, and the scratches seemed to echo in my mind, lingering like they were carved into the memory itself. The air inside the car felt thick suddenly, and I realized I was holding my breath. I had been gripping the wheel tightly, knuckles white, shoulders tense. The low rumble of the engine was the only sound, accompanied by the occasional creak of the suspension over small cracks in the road. I slowed down a little, not wanting to admit to myself how much the sight of that figure had shaken me. The streets beyond the overpass were quiet, suburban in their familiarity, but the image of the crouched figure remained lodged in my mind. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the lines of the road, and the light of passing street lamps reflecting off wet patches of asphalt. The way the car felt under my hands, the faint scent of the dashboard and upholstery. The scratches kept appearing in my memory with uncanny clarity. The way their jagged edges seemed almost intentional, like marks left to be noticed. I replayed the image of the crouched figure, wondering if I'd seen it clearly or if it had been a trick of shadow and light. Every logical explanation I tried to convince myself of fell apart under the weight of how precise the scratches had been. I reached a familiar intersection, and the city lights began to scatter ahead, soft yellow against the black night. The transition was jarring, the sudden brightness, the sense of safety returning. I parked the car outside my apartment, the familiar click of the lock a small relief, but the tension in my shoulders remained. I sat there for a long moment, hands still on the wheel, staring at the dashboard lights, feeling the residual adrenaline prickling my skin. I kept thinking about the scratches, about the crouched figure, about the emptiness of the overpass, and how quiet it had been except for the echo of the car's engine. Later, when I finally got out, I examined the underside of the overpass from a distance. The concrete was darkened by age, the graffiti faded, and the scratches were still visible under the glow of my phone's flashlight. They were long and jagged, extending along the surface as if someone had made them deliberately, carefully, and then disappeared. The figure never appeared again, but the market, or whoever it was, left behind had a permanence that no shadow could replicate. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't supernatural. It was real. Someone had been there, crouched at the edge, watching, and they had left the scratches to be seen. The knowledge of that, of someone moving so deliberately in the darkness, of the randomness of who they might be and why they were there, stayed with me long after the overpass disappeared behind the city streets. The night hadn't been haunted by spirits, but had been claimed by someone else's presence, sharp and deliberate and entirely real. Even now, I can remember the feel of the air under that bridge, the smell of concrete and wet leaves, the sound of the car echoing the flickering streetlights. I remember the exact curve of the scratches and the silhouette crouched at the edge, and I know that when night falls again and I drive past that overpass, I will slow down instinctively because I know the darkness there is not empty. It belongs to someone else, and the scratches are proof that they are still watching, still waiting, even if I never see them again. I left Tucson late that night, just past midnight, driving home from a small family gathering. The roads were quiet, the city lights fading behind me as I took the highway south, thinking I had plenty of time. My car was the only moving thing on the stretch. The desert sprawled wide and dark on either side, silent except for the low hum of the engine. I remember feeling relaxed at first, letting the monotony of the drive wash over me, the way you do when you've driven the same route 100 times. The GPS sat mounted on the dash, glowing faintly, giving me a calm sense of direction that usually meant everything was fine. Then I missed the exit. It happened suddenly. One moment I was focused on the road, and the next I was too far to turn off without cutting across lanes. I cursed softly under my breath and prepared to make the next loop back, but the highway curved sharply, and before I could correct, I found myself on a narrow stretch of pavement that wasn't in my memory. The GPS immediately froze, the little blue dust spinning for a moment, then refusing to recalculate. I checked the map on the screen. It was blank. No markings, no roads, just a vast beige expanse that matched the desert around me. I kept driving, thinking maybe it was some small connector road that would eventually pop back onto the highway. The asphalt ended abruptly. In its place was a dirt road, pale and uneven, dust trailing behind the tires. Headlights cut through nothing but darkness. No houses, no power lines, no streetlights, no landmarks at all. Only desert, sharp cactus silhouettes, and the occasional tumbleweed pushed along by a faint, dry breeze. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. The car felt smaller somehow, swallowed by the vast openness around me. The silence pressed against me. I couldn't hear anything besides the tires crunching over sand and loose gravel. I noticed the tire tracks first in the periphery of my headlights. At first, I thought another car had passed recently. I squinted, trying to see the shape, but there was no vehicle, no lights in the distance, nothing. The tracks ran parallel to mine, perfectly aligned for a few feet. That in itself wasn't strange. People drove these roads too, but something about them made me slow down. They were enormous, much wider than any car or truck tire I'd seen. The grooves were deep, pressed into the soft sand, like something heavy had moved with purpose. I slowed more, my chest tightening, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I followed the tracks with my eyes, trying to make sense of them, to rationalize what I was seeing. The tracks didn't curve naturally. They shifted abruptly as if the vehicle, or whatever it was, had turned sharply and disappeared. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped entirely, vanishing at the edge of a small wash. There was no bridge, no path continuing beyond the dip, just a sandy gully carved shallowly into the desert floor. The tracks ended as if whatever had made them had lifted itself off the ground and left no trace. My heart was hammering in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears. I could feel sweat starting along my hairline despite the dry desert air. I slammed the brakes instinctively, skidding slightly on the loose dirt, and brought the car to a halt just before the wash. I leaned forward, my hands trembling slightly, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Nothing moved. No animals, no dust clouds, no lights. Just the empty desert and the faint wind brushing against the brush. I stared at the tracks, feeling the weight of the darkness around me, the impossibility of what I was seeing pressing in. I forced myself to take a deep breath and rationalize. Maybe someone had driven a heavy vehicle down a side path I hadn't noticed. Maybe it was a construction vehicle, a large piece of farm equipment, something that had left those tracks before disappearing into the wash. That made some sense, and it was the only explanation I could find. But the feeling in my chest didn't ease. Something about the way the tracks stopped, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished, made the rational explanations feel thin, like a fragile mask over raw unease. I didn't linger longer than a few seconds. I put the car back in drive and pressed on slowly, keeping my eyes on the road, the headlights illuminating only the immediate stretch of dirt ahead. The road twisted slightly, nothing straight for long enough to see far ahead. The desert kept its silent, endless vigil on either side. My mind kept returning to the tracks, their width, the abrupt stop, the empty wash. I couldn't see anything beyond the headlights, and the GPS still refused to respond. I had no idea where I was in relation to the highway. Every slight bump in the road, every scrape of gravel, made me flinch. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched. The car's tires rattled over rocks and sand, and the darkness around me felt almost physical, pressing in on the cabin. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of cactus shadows that seemed impossibly tall and close, their shapes distorted by the uneven light of the headlights. I imagined turning to check the back seat, my pulse spiking, even though I knew I was alone. My stomach was tight, a mix of adrenaline and the dry heat of the desert air pressing in from the cracked window. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glimmer in the distance. It was a ribbon of asphalt catching the faint glow of my headlights. Relief flooded through me. I drove toward it carefully, every nerve on edge, until I finally emerged back onto a small two-lane highway, a road I recognized. Signs confirmed my location. Tucson was still to the north, and this road would take me back to the familiar route. My hands loosened on the wheel for the first time, the tension in my chest slowly dissipating. The GPS immediately recalculated, placing me back on the correct path. I drove the remaining miles in silence, watching the desert fall away to familiar suburbs and the distant lights of the city. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat for a long time with the engine off, staring at the streetlight outside, letting the normal sounds of the night, dogs barking, distant traffic, fill the empty space left by the desert. The tire tracks still haunted me, their size, their sudden disappearance, the sheer emptiness of that stretch of dirt road. But in the harsh light of day, I convinced myself it had been a truck, a heavy vehicle, maybe even a large ranching machine that had used the wash to turn around. That explanation was enough to make the memory bearable. I never went back to that road. I avoided that exit for months, and I still take a longer route when I head south at night. I told myself it was a mistake, a misjudged exit, and some oddly timed tracks, but the unease never fully left. Even weeks later, I would think back to that night, to the sudden stop of the enormous tire tracks, and feel the pulse of tension rise in my chest. It was real, grounded, tangible, a strange, quiet encounter with the desert at its most empty and silent. It reminded me how alone a person can feel in the middle of nowhere, and how quickly the familiar can vanish when the road turns unexpectedly. The desert itself hadn't changed. Nothing was there beyond what the headlights revealed, and yet the memory felt permanent. The silence, the stillness, the way the tracks seemed to defy explanation. It left a mark I could not ignore. Driving home that night had been ordinary at first, but those few minutes on the unmarked dirt road near Tucson became something I carried with me. A reminder that some parts of the world exist entirely outside routine, untouched, where even reason struggles to explain what is real. I've been driving through back roads for hours, letting the headlights carve a path through the dense darkness. The fight with my roommate earlier in the evening had left me jittery, tense, and restless. I didn't have a destination, just the urge to move, to put distance between myself and the cramped apartment that smelled of arguments and unfinished laundry. The roads were narrow and winding, bordered by trees that leaned over like they were whispering secrets. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that muted any moonlight, leaving the world around me in a uniform, thick black. Every few minutes, I would pass a farmhouse or a cluster of lights, but mostly the roads were empty, and the emptiness pressed in on me. I kept my speed moderate, partly because of the rain that had started as a fine drizzle, leaving slick streaks on the windshield, and partly because there was no reason to rush. The rhythmic swish of the wipers, the soft hum of the tires on asphalt, and the occasional thump of my heartbeat became the only measure of time. I passed one abandoned lot after another, old barns with sagging roofs, telephone poles leaning slightly, each silhouette distorted by the dark. It felt like the road itself was stretching on endlessly, and the monotony was starting to seep into my thoughts, making me question how long I'd been driving or even where exactly I was. Then, up ahead, a light appeared. It was small, artificial, and almost jarring in the darkness. A 24-hour gas station. Its fluorescent bulbs buzzed faintly, illuminating the wet asphalt around it. The sign flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the pumps. I felt a surge of relief at the sight. I needed coffee, and I needed the brief reassurance of seeing another human being, no matter how tired or strange they might look. I slowed, pulled into a pump, and switched off the engine. The wet air clung to the car, carrying the smell of rain and the faint, chemical scent of gasoline. The asphalt beneath the tires reflected the bright lights, making the station seem larger than it was, almost unreal in its isolation. I stepped out to pump gas, the nozzle cold in my hand, and noticed the puddles forming around my shoes. The rain had stopped again, leaving the air thick and slightly warm, the kind of warmth that makes you notice every detail. The lot was empty except for my car, the gas station itself. Inside, a cashier moved behind the counter, barely visible, absorbed in something that made no sound to me. I turned back to the car to double-check the gas level when movement caught my eye. A man was approaching from the edge of the lot, his figure emerging from the shadows cast by the flickering light. He was wearing a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, and his clothes were soaked. Drops of water clung to the brim and shoulders, falling onto the ground with quiet, precise taps. He muttered something, but the words were indistinguishable, swallowed by the faint hum of the neon sign and the distant rumble of the road behind me. My first instinct was to roll up the window. The man stopped just a few feet from the car, standing still like he had always been part of the night. His head tilted slightly, as if he was listening, though the silence around us made that impossible. I studied him through the rearview mirror. The shape of him, slumped shoulders, wet hat, shifting eyes, made the edges of the world feel sharper. The gas station, the pumps, the light, my own hands holding the steering wheel inside the car, all felt distant, as though I'd been dropped into a photograph where the colors had been removed but the tension remained. I didn't hear any footsteps approaching, but I could sense the faint imprint of him in the air, like the space around him was heavier, slightly warmer from being occupied. I thought about speaking, but nothing came out, and I realized I hadn't moved in some time. My hands gripped the steering wheel without thinking, and I noticed the way the reflection of the fluorescent lights bounced on the wet hood. Time slowed down, stretched itself across the puddles, across the empty lot, across the faint buzz of the sign. Then, without warning, he was gone. I checked again, moving my head slightly, and the space where he had been stood empty. No footprints marred the wet asphalt. No car doors, no shadow at the edge of the lot. Just nothing. I stared at the emptiness for what felt like several heartbeats, my chest tightening. The lot itself, with its bright lights and puddles, seemed alive, like it had absorbed him, like the very air had swallowed his presence. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, heavier than the rain-soaked night air, as if the world had a memory I couldn't access. I turned back to the gas pump, trying to rationalize. Maybe I hadn't seen him clearly. Maybe he had ducked behind the pump, or maybe he had retreated down the dark edges of the property. Rational thoughts circled my mind, but none of them fully fit. There was no evidence, no proof of movement, no sound. Just the empty lot and the soft hum of neon light. My body tensed, and I could feel the sweat forming on my neck, not from heat, but from alertness. Something had shifted in the air, in the geometry of space around me. A sense that the world could rearrange itself without warning, and I had no control over it. I finished pumping the gas mechanically, my mind looping over every detail. The way his hat had clung to his head, the glisten of water on his shoulders, the low, murmuring sound I hadn't understood. I started the car, the engine sound brash and almost intrusive in the sudden silence, and I pulled away slowly, keeping the lights of the station in view for longer than necessary. The lot remained empty behind me, and as I drove, I found myself glancing into the rearview mirror repeatedly, expecting to see him on the road, walking along the shoulder, or appearing from some hidden shadow. But there was nothing, only the dark road stretching out, bordered by leaning trees and the occasional glint of a distant reflective sign. The rest of the drive was quiet, but the world felt different. The dark edges of the roads were no longer just the absence of light. They were filled with expectation. Every reflection in the wet asphalt, every movement of leaves along the roadside, every passing house or abandoned lot carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I kept my speed steady, telling myself it was just nerves, the mind playing tricks after a fight and a late-night drive. But even rational explanations felt thin, fragile against the memory of that brief, impossibly precise encounter. By the time I reached the main road again, the empty stretches gave way to familiar lights, traffic hums, and the distant glow of a city that had seemed unreachable hours before. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. I parked the car near a well-lit convenience store, stepped out, and looked back down the road. The back roads were empty, stretching into darkness, still damp and still silent. I realized I would never know where he had gone or how he had vanished, but the memory of it lingered in a precise, undeniable way. I walked inside, bought coffee, and let the normalcy of fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, and the smell of brewed beans pull me back to a world that made sense. The wet night, the empty lot, the man in the soaked hat, all of it receded, contained now in a memory that would surface whenever I drove those back roads again. It was real, but it was also gone, leaving only a quiet reminder that some moments, no matter how brief, leave their shape on the mind in a way nothing else can. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle, knowing that the world was back in order, that I had escaped the weight of that night. Yet, even as I finished and walked to my car, I glanced once more down the dark road, and for a moment, the emptiness seemed to watch me back.